Okay, Fry's been thinking about the munitions restocking that everyone knows is obviously required after the US provided Ukraine with substantial weapons under Biden and under Trump. Israel obviously is getting a lot, and the US is now using a lot of their munitions, and there's certainly a lot of talk that they're running low. So the munitions restocking comes to a head. Need to have a look. Are the big munitions suppliers, manufacturers, going to be worth investing in? And there's some very big flashing lights in my mind. So I'm going to do this over 3 separate reports because I think it's more important than many people think. There's a lot of geopolitical issues involved, not just financial market. Okay, the thesis is right, but it's basically all priced in. The big 4 primes beat estimates and all 4 raised their guidance in late July. However, the market's reaction is telling us more than the results. Northrop beat both lines, raised guidance, printed a record backlog, and the shares fell 2.5%. When good news produces a negative reaction, the market's telling us it's not news anymore. The thesis being right doesn't mean the trade is ready. Ask Dr. Burry. The rest of the report is really about the not will the orders come, they've already come, but can they be converted and at what margin? And the very important parts, 2 physical constraints we'll talk about. 1, the solid rocket motor bottleneck, and the other, the rare earth controls. And neither of those are going to respond to price changes. And that's the frame for everything that follows. Okay, so all 4 primes in the last few weeks have reported, and they all beat and raised expectations. We'll run through them. Lockheed reported on the 22nd of July, record backlog to $230 billion, up about $64 billion year on year, with a book-to-bill of 3.2 to 1, meaning they booked more than 3 times what they billed in the quarter. That's an enormous order intake relative to current output. And it's exactly the kind of number that gets the restocking narrative punters excited. Sales were up 11% to $20.1 million. Earnings per share came in at $7.94, and free cash flow swung from minus $150 million to plus $2.9 billion. Missiles and fire control revenue was up 20% on the PAC-3 and Precision Strike, plus THAAD. They raised guidance to 8% growth at the midpoint after 5%. The next day, RTX reported backlog up 22% at $289 billion. Split roughly $170 billion commercial aerospace and $119 billion defence. The Raytheon segments specifically, Patriot, Standard and AMRAAM grew 18% to $8.27 billion. They raised full-year guidance to $96 billion from $93.5 billion. And there's something we'll get into about RTX on the next slide relating to Europe. Northrop reported on the 21st of July. The number that matters most isn't actually in this table on the slide. It's what happened to the share price. and we'll look at that in a bit more depth in a couple of slides. For now, net awards of 20 billion, book to bill 1.84, record backlog of 105 billion, up 17%, sales up 5% to 10.88 billion, adjusted earnings per share $7.68 against a consensus of $6.82. That's a beat of over 12%. Guidance raised. By any conventional reading, that's an excellent quarter. And L3Harris reported on the 29th, beat on revenue and adjusted earnings per share, raised guidance, record backlog $42 million. The detail I want to file away is that L3Harris owns Aerojet Rocketdyne, which puts them on one side of the bottleneck we'll get to shortly. Lockheed's contract flow is the most eye-catching. A $35 billion 7-year Missile Defense Agency award in June to quadruple THAAD output, plus GMLRS and the HIMARS, which I assume are rocket things. Radar money, a Golden Dome interceptor prototype selection, and then subsequently up from $53.86 billion for the PAC-3 MSE interceptors, with the Archibald, Pennsylvania facility doubling in size and adding around 700 jobs, if they go ahead. That's real, funded expansion. It's a genuine signal of intent. For I would like to have that word intent in bold letters. About half of Raytheon's first half bookings, around $10 billion, were international, and $7 billion of that was European. European rearmament is now a swing factor for RTX's missile book that's comparable in scale to the Pentagon itself. If you're tracking European defence spending as a macro theme, RTX's Raytheon segment is an immediate, clear indicator. However, now the cracks. Northrop's headline was superb, but margins actually fell in defence systems and space on negative estimate at completion adjustments. The accounting mechanism where a program's projected costs get revised, usually upward when something's going wrong. Two names sit behind that, SIAW and the GEM 36XL, solid rocket motor anomaly. Still under root cause investigation, that sounds costly. That phrase, solid rocket anomaly, is the first thread connecting back to the bottleneck slide. And it's not a coincidence that it shows up at Northrop, one of only 2 US SRM suppliers. And that's the whole point of this slide. The headline numbers are clean, but the contract detail and the margin detail are where the real story is hiding. That's true of a lot of things in economics. The aggregate numbers reassure you, but the disaggregated number is where you actually learn something. Okay, priced in. Northrop beat on both lines, raised guidance, record backlog, and the shares fell 2.5% to $510.84 against a 52-week high of $774. Lockheed's release drew a similar shrug from the market. If you only remember one fact from this video, make it this one. A stock falling on a genuine beat is the market telling us that the factors are not currently in our favour for a straightforward long thesis. As the good news is already in the price, and possibly a tad more. So why is conversion hard mechanically? 3 reasons. First, a lot of this backlog, the THAAD and April Patriot Awards, 4.7 billion of it, is what's called undefinitized, American word. It can't be fully funded until Congress actually appropriates the money. A headline contract number is a promise, not a cash in the door. And Congress moves on its own calendar, not the markets. Second, physical production rates lag the orders badly. THAAD is running at a surge rate of around 96 interceptors a year. 96 only, against a planned expansion of 400. Tomahawk procurement averaged just 86 a year over the decade. That's an average over the decade to 2026. And recent output is under 200 against a stated capacity of 1,000 a year. You can raise all the guidance you like, but you can't ship what you haven't built. And building it takes physical time, and no amount of enthusiasm shortens that. Building it also requires input, which we will get to. Third, Lockheed CEO Thesis talking about going faster, faster, faster is not him boasting about capability. Read in context, it's him reporting pressure from being applied by the Deputy Secretary of Defence, or War, or whatever they are calling it. That's a very different signal. One is, look how good we are. The other is, someone above us is unhappy with the pace and promising the president what can't be done. Thus, focusing on reading management language for what it's actually signalling rather than what it sounds like on the surface is a skill worth building. So, backlog is no longer news, conversion is, or probability of conversion. The market has finished pricing the existence of the orders. What it hasn't finished pricing, because nobody yet knows the answer, is how fast and at what margin those orders turn into delivered hardware and recognised revenue. And Fry will add here, if they can get built. More to come. Right, now we'll go into some detail on the physical constraints. Solid rocket motor is, in essence, the propulsion stage of a missile, and the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, calls it the single most consequential constraint in the entire US missile defence industrial base. Not funding, not political will, a physical manufacturing bottleneck. Here's the history, and it's a case study in industrial concentration. Okay, one that I won't go into that. Between 2000 and 2015, the US solid rocket motor industry consolidated from 6 suppliers down to 2, Aerojet and Rocketdyne, which L3Harris owns, and Orbital ATK, which Northrop now owns. Norway's Nammo fills in around the edges for some weapons, but essentially it's a duopoly sitting underneath the entire US missile production base. Duopoly, 2 companies. And it goes a level deeper than that. Both of these 2 suppliers are, in Govini's phrase, tethered to a handful of shared suppliers. For the components underneath them, cases, igniters, nozzles, the L3Harris CEO himself said they sometimes have only 1 or 2 certified suppliers for those parts. So it's not easy. It's not really a duopoly at the top. It's a duopoly sitting on top of a monopoly or close to it further down. This isn't theoretical. Accurate Energy Systems supplied Aerojet, Northrop and Nammo simultaneously. One small company feeding all three of the significant players in this space. It suffered a fatal plant explosion in October 2025. Very suspicious. When the entire industry's redundancy runs through, when your entire industry's redundancy runs through a handful of shared sub-tier suppliers, a single accident or incident at a single facility is a systematic event, not a local one. The Patriot Seeker tells the same story, but from a different angle. Boeing builds every single PAC-3 MSE active radar seeker at one facility in Huntsville, Alabama, and only delivered about 650, maybe 700 of them in 2025. The Pentagon signed a framework in April 2026 to try to triple that output, which itself is an admission that final assembly capacity means nothing if the sub-tier component feeding it can't keep up, which is the case at present. So let's repeat. The Pentagon wants over 2,100 air-to-missile defence interceptors delivered in calendar year 2027, about 70% more than the about 1,300 delivered in 2021, against a stated underlying requirement of about 5,000 a year across the US Army, Navy and Air Force. That gap doesn't close with a good quarter. It closes, if it closes at all, over years of capital investment in propellant and component manufacturing. Okay, rare earth export controls. Now, this is the constraint Fry's really focusing on. This is serious, genuinely serious, because it's not only about economics in the traditional sense, it's geopolitics in an economics costume. Okay, I want to be very clear. These controls are aimed at defence by design, or the defence industry by design by China. They are not incidentally catching defence applications as collateral damage from some broader trade dispute. This is planned. From the 1st of December 2025, any company in China with an affiliation to a foreign military, including America's, China has basically denied export licenses for the relevant materials. 7 elements are restricted: samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, yttrium. You can tell I didn't study chemistry. Notice what's not on the list: the light rare earths, where processing capacity is more diverse globally. They were deliberately left alone. Beijing picked precisely the medium and heavy rare earths that matter for defence electronics and magnets, and left the commercially diverse, easy to get, untouched, or easier to get. So that's not a blunt instrument, that's a scalpel. Plans. And the controls reach further than we'd expect. They're extraterritorial. Samarium cobalt magnets, neodymium iron boron magnets containing terbium or dysprosium, and frankly any part or assembly containing as little as 0.1%, bugger all, Chinese origin input or made using Chinese process technology falls under the rule. That 0.1 threshold is deliberately punishing. It makes it very hard for a Western manufacturer to simply source around the restriction by blending inputs. The dependence numbers explain why this really bites. China accounts for 60% of global mining and over 90% of refining, according to the International Energy Agency. The US relies on China for around 70% of its rare earth imports, according to the US Geological Survey. Say it again. US relies on China for around 70% of its rare earth inputs. And until 2023, China held 99% of the global heavy rare earth processing capacity. The one alternative, a very small Vietnamese refinery, which is basically under Chinese control, has been shut for a year on a tax dispute, which leaves something very close to an effective monopoly controlled by China. Where does this actually bite? Precisely the systems being restocked. The F-35 Virginia and Columbia-class submarines, the Tomahawk, radar systems, Predator drones, the JDAM family. The F-35 aircraft alone uses up 50 pounds, 20 kilos of samarium cobalt magnets per airframe for high-temperature electronics cooling. One cannot build an F-35 without that magnet. There is a fixed proportions these systems are engineered to. No substitute. No substitute. The buffer is running down, which is the part the market hasn't fully absorbed yet. And Fry would say not just the market hasn't absorbed it, generally it's not in the news that I can see, not that I read the mainstream, but people are aware of this. It's dangerous. China cut exports back in April 2025 and by August was sitting on stockpiles rather than releasing them outside the country. US National Defense reported on the 1st of July 2026 that those critical magnet mineral stockpiles are beginning to dwindle after 15 months of drawdown running alongside a production surge. And then on the 22nd of June 2026, China added 10 US entities to its export control list, including MP Materials and USA Rare Earths, plus 8 defence-linked firms. So note who got targeted. The two American companies actually building the alternative supply chain. That's not about blocking current consumption. That's about blocking substitution, stopping the US from building its way out of this dependency. The US response tells you how seriously Washington is taking this. The Department of Defense took a $400 million equity stake in MP Materials in 2025. Think about that. A government taking an equity position in a mining company is not ordinary industrial policy. That's the state deciding a supply chain is too strategically important to leave to the markets. Lynas received $120 million for the first commercial heavy rare earth separation facility on US soil. There's a $12 billion Import-Export Bank of the United States, backed stockpiling program called Project Vault, and a Korea-chaired forum called Forge that launched in February 2026, with LS, POSCO and Korea Zinc as partners. There's also a 2027 ban on Chinese origin rare earths in defence applications scheduled to take full effect. All of that is years of build-out, not a quarter's work. Okay, this fails the standard models. Fryer said this has the same structure as the Hormuz commodity cascade. And what I mean is a physically tiny input gating a very large economic output. And the standard textbook model actually gets this wrong if you apply it naively. I won't bore you with all the academic articles, though I will provide if anyone's interested. Basically, there's no clever substitution that gets you around it. The theory tells you why a tiny market can gate a very large one. And it's very relevant to a line from Charlie Munger that I use regularly. If the facts don't hang together on a latticework of theory, you don't have them in usable form. We've discussed something like this. Helium is a tiny market, but don't dismiss a constraint just because the dollar value of input looks small on its own. We've discussed helium shortage due to Hormuz, bromine, very little, but they bugger everything up if they're not there. Samarium is a tiny market too. Saying so is worse than useless without the theory. Hulton's network propagation work, Barqui and Fatih, tell us why a small market gates a large one. That's the whole discipline, building a proper latticework rather than collecting disconnected facts. Watch list. Okay, this slide's showing some specific things to watch for and very roughly when to expect them. Congressional funding of the undefinitized THAAD and Patriot awards on an ongoing basis. That's what converts a headline number into actual cash. Book-to-bill ratios after this initial wave of restock awards clears, due in Q3 when Lockheed, Northrop and RTX report in late October. That tells us whether demand is structural and repeating or a one-off catch-up that fades once the current backlog is worked through, if it can be. Further EAC adjustments at Northrop on SIAW and the GEM 63XL motor issues also due in Q3. That's the physical constraint from the solid rocket motor, SRM bottleneck, showing up directly in reported margin, which is about to close as you get to a real-time read on whether the bottleneck is easing or worsening. Interceptor delivery rates against that 2,100 target for calendar 2023, that's a rolling indicator. And honestly, the most honest measure of conversion there is, because it's a physical count rather than a counting or contract figure, which tend to be dodgy. China's suspended second wave of export controls is due 10th of November 2026. Mark that date, because if it goes ahead, it's a fresh escalation on the rare earth side. And finally, watch contract start shifting towards cost-plus structures, which is the prime's own way of protecting margin against input cost inflation, which has already hit and will get worse. If you start seeing that shift in contract awards, that's a tacit admission from the primes themselves that fixed price risk on these bottleneck inputs is getting too hard to underwrite. Okay, let's go for the counter case. Fryer in each report tries to provide both sides of an argument, though clearly he spent 8 slides arguing one side and the last slide to give the opposite thought. But I want to do analysis, so I do look at both sides. Let's have a look at the bull case properly. The backlogs are genuine and enormous. These are not speculative or paper orders. They're real government commitments. Capacity investment is real and it's funded. The Archibald doubling, $1 billion Pentagon commitment specifically to L3Harris solid rocket motor capacity, more than 30 L3Harris facilities being built or expanded. Defence budgets have durable bipartisan political support in Washington, and NATO members have agreed a 5% of GDP spending target, which is a structural tailwind that doesn't depend on any single election cycle. Plus, there's a wave of new solid rocket motor entrants. Expo, Urza, Major, Firehawk, Castellan, Anduril, Namo, Avio USA, Prometheus, Energetics that could genuinely diversify the supplier base away from the current duopoly. Though the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, itself notes that many of these are still in prototype stage and haven't moved into large production lots yet. Several years, numerous years before they will become a factor. So here's the balanced read, and Fryer thinks this is the fairest summary I can give you. The thesis is right, and it's largely consensus, which, as any of you who've traded for a while will recognise, that's not where the money is. Consensus right trades tend to be already reflected in the price, which loops us straight back to the already priced slide. The genuinely differentiated question, the one where the edge might actually exist, is conversion risk. And it sits down in the sub-tier of the supply chain, which is exactly where report 3 in the series is going to take us. Be back for report 2.